Good evening, Southern California. Good late evening, New York and US points east. And good morning, Istanbul, China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. I know you're all here. Well, wherever you are, we welcome you to the first gathering of UCLA Arts 10 Questions Reckoning 2020. And this is indeed a time of reckoning. Not uniquely so, but urgently so. These 10 questions seek to address our attunement to the health of our planet, to equity and opportunity for all, to a pandemic and communal health during COVID-19, and to the health of our democracy. Tonight, we begin a series of 10 weekly inquiries with the question, what is presence? What could be more relevant as we join together in front of our screens across California, the US, and the world, from our homes, workspaces, and other places of presence? What have we discovered about ourselves as we safe distance in quarantine? If we cannot be together in person, then what does presence mean? As separations between public and private, work and family, here and there dissolve, who are we and what do we bring to being together? Is presence about showing up or something more? How are we responsible for ensuring that others feel the fullness of their presence? For those who are joining us for the first time, 10 Questions is an academic course offered by the School of the Arts and Architecture and simultaneously a public platform for thoughtful engagement with our extended community. COVID-19 has challenged all of us in many ways, but silver lining warning, here at UCLA, it is helping us to be a university without walls, a place where the public can convene without having to traverse a gridlocked city during rush hour, and without even having to be in Los Angeles. It is here with you that we are bringing together the treasured resources of the university to build capacity in this time of urgent need and great precarity. We do not ask questions because we intend to find a singular, coherent answer, as much as we ask questions to discover more about the question and to inquire more deeply into our lives. The format for this evening will include a 10-minute presentation from each of our panelists, followed by a brief conversation amongst them. We'll then immediately shift to what I'm simply calling engagement. New for us this year, and perhaps a benefit of being remote, you, students and members of our audience, will have the opportunity to gather together to engage in a small group discussion in, you guessed it, a Zoom breakout room. The objective of these small rooms and these small discussions is to converse amongst yourselves about what you've heard and perhaps come up with a question for consideration by our panelists. After the breakout sessions, we will reconvene in the webinar for a discussion with our esteemed guests, Tiffany Brannon, Mishuana Goeman, and Carlson. Our first panelist tonight is Dr. Tiffany Brannon, an assistant professor in the UCLA Department of Psychology. Her research examines socio-cultural identities in negatively stereotyped groups and investigates the potential for these identities to serve as psychological resources and function as powerful agents of social change. Tiffany, welcome.
Greetings. Okay. Greetings. COVID-19 is a defining social issue of our present time. It has touched every individual and institution. It has also revealed and magnified pervasive social issues, including racial inequality. It has shattered the illusion that individuals are and can be separable from context, such as social issues, social roles, and obligations. Currently, contexts, some shared and some not, are impacting how students, faculty, and staff are carrying out tasks tied to their daily life. Racial inequality may be impacting students and scholars, yet what might be helpful for individuals to know is that the weight of the present can be empowering. This message may provide needed optimism, as so many social issues facing us are systemic. They are big problems. And as individuals, especially as students or researchers, some might feel powerless to affect change. Yet by integrating our curiosity, passion, and concern for such social issues into the very tasks that we carry out on a daily basis, we can contribute to structural and symbolic solutions. And to illustrate this idea, I want to share with you a couple of examples that come from social science, including sociology and psychology. Next slide, please. And so to ground my examples that I will share about the power of embracing the present, I want to share with you a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, but I also want to ground his quote in what seems like a contradiction in our present modern mainstream American society when we think about what it means to be in the present moment. So often when we're asked to be in the present moment, we often think that we're supposed to tune out the world around us, right? That we're supposed to be separable from our social obligations and roles, right? That we're supposed to be detached from context. And the realities of the present moment have made that very challenging, difficult, and in fact, very frustrating. And so I want to welcome in the idea that it actually can be very empowering to actually leverage context, right? To not try to be detached, to not try to be separable from the present moment. And so to do that, I want to share with you some of the exact words from W.E.B. Du Bois that he is a reckoning that he had as a social scientist. And this happened in the context of a different crisis that happened in 1899. And this is when public lynchings were happening in the American South. And this was a lynching in particular that happened involving Sam Hose in 1899. It was in response to this lynching that W.E.B. Du Bois wrote of his scholarship and his role as a scientist, that one could not be calm, cool, and a detached scientist. And using the language of the time, he said, while Negroes were being lynched, murdered, and starved. And W.E.B. Du Bois went on in 1903 to write The Souls of Black Folks and to famously coin the expression in the statement that the problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line. Next slide, please. And so I want to invite you in our conversation today to think about what it means to be in the present moment without the expectation of being calm, cool, and detached, right? To welcome in all of the context that is impacting us right now, both all of the social issues that are intersectional. Next slide, please. And so to give you some examples of how this can be empowering and how this in and of itself can actually speak to some of our systemic social inequalities, I want to give you some examples of when science, in particular psychological science, has actually welcomed in the social context, and it actually has made for stronger scientific insights that actually have application for the real world. And the first example comes from 2005, when then President Larry Summers made headlines for stating that if there are gender differences in which men or people who identify as men are more represented in STEM fields, so science, technology, and engineering fields, than women, this is due to differences in aptitudes. And this statement by then President Larry Summers literally made newspaper headlines, which I will show in a few slides. But what I have on the screen now, what I'm showing with you, is an article that appeared in Science, which is one of the top, if not the premier, peer-reviewed publication outlet across all of science, in which social scientists actually use this context that was happening in the real world to actually show the impact of statements like this on the impact of the performance of women in STEM fields. Next slide, please. And so this is just one headline that appeared just to bring us back to 2005. Next slide, please. Another headline from 2005. And next slide, please. And so this is the actual study that the authors in their science article used that really spoke to, well, what is the impact? Because lots of people were debating it, of having a world-renowned leader like the president of Harvard University say that there are genetic differences between the performance of people who identify as men and people who identify as women on STEM outcomes. And so what's shown on this screen, this is the math performance on the y-axis, so the number correct, as well as the math score. The data is replicated. And so what you see on the x-axis is what is the performance of self-identified women when they're told there's no difference in how men and women perform on tasks like this. What is the difference when they're told when stereotype threat, which is when a stereotype that's relevant to your group is made relevant, how does that impact performance? As well as when they're told that there are genetic differences in the intellectual ability between men and women. And then also a final condition on the far right, the darkest black bars. What if they're told that there are differences in the representation of men and women in STEM fields, but those differences represent differences in access to structural resources. They do not represent intellectual differences. And what you find is that it's the genetics, so it's talking about ability as genetic or inducing stereotype threat that actually undermines the performance of women in STEM. Next slide, please. Similarly, in my own research is another example of the power of welcoming in context or society into science instead of trying to be detached from it. More recently, this year, diversity and inclusion programs have come under attack. And so here are two recent headlines. Next slide, please, tied to that. And so I want to share with you, next slide, please. A recent article that was published by myself and collaborator Andy Lynn, in which we directly look at these headline grabbing assertions that have actually called into question whether diversity and inclusion initiatives, are they harming inclusion? Are they divisive? And we actually were able to test this question empirically. Next slide, please. And we were able to show using a large longitudinal data set of African American and Latinx college students that actually the opposite is true, that despite these more recent headlines, that it's pride experiences, so experiences like taking diversity courses and participating in groups on campus tied to diversity and inclusion, that those types of pride experiences they positively impact in-group closeness and in turn, a sense of belonging and a variety of other outcomes. And so I just want to end there by suggesting from a scientific and empirical perspective that it can be really helpful to actually tune in the present moment, to pay attention to context, to think about how you might integrate the concerns, the social issues that actually might be arousing anxiety, frustration, anything that's the opposite of calm in you, to try to think about how you might channel that into actually getting good empirical data to address those social issues. And so I want to, as we start a new academic year, I just want to end by inviting people to integrate their different social identities, to integrate the things that are concerning them into the world, into the work that they do, into their scholarship. Thank you.
Wow, Tiffany, thank you so much. At this moment, I'm just thinking about how to be calm, cool, and collected, detached in the face of violence is also to not be fully present. Yeah. And how much discrimination impacts the ability of our ability to be present and to fulfill the fullness of our abilities. I know there's much more to say, but I just wanted to underline a couple of those things there. It's really a wonderful introduction to a school year and to a quarter. Thank you so much. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Mishuana Goeman, a member of the Tonawanda Band of Seneca. Mishuana is a professor of gender studies, the chair of American Indian Studies, affiliated faculty of critical race studies in the law school, and the inaugural special advisor to the Chancellor on Native American and Indigenous affairs at UCLA. Her research examines colonialism, geography, and literature in ways that generate anti-colonial tools in the struggle for social justice. Mishuana, welcome.
Thank you. Sikan, everybody. It's very nice to be here, and I appreciate the invitation to get to talk about items that are important with presence, especially as it concerns American Indians and how they are often left out of that presence. So when asked about the question about what does presence mean to me, I was traveling to my homelands, Haudenosaunee territory, in what you might recognize as upper state New York. After quarantining in Maine, a place where I grew up close to Penobscot and Passamaquoddy, people of the Dawn. Upon entering my territories, I smelled the clean air of rivers, pine, and damp earth. I went down the river with my family and remembered all those places I gathered fiddleheads, or what they refer to as ramps in fancier restaurants of LA, which I do frequent. In Salamanca, I walked in the gathering places of sweetgrass and again remembered what it felt, truly felt, to have an embodied sovereignty. That is a form of sovereignty that through my lifeline and presence in my territory, reaches far deeper than racial identifiers of me as American Indian or government-approved concepts of sovereignty that limits one and encloses them in bounded territories of racialized landscapes and property logics. It is to understand land and water as connected, not that which is divided, and that your presence on the land relies on understanding that you are a touch point of responsibility. In your embodied sovereignty, you have accountability to the gifts we have been given, the gifts of the land and the gifts of your own talent to enact a presence on the land. I see the presence of my people throughout New York with place names everywhere that reflect the power of place and language, even if that power seems lost to a majority of Americans. We have that power. We have that embodied sovereignty, and we have that sovereignty within our territories. One river memory connected to another, and I felt the presence of my childhood, my ancestors, and my family. I also began writing these marks during the weekend commemoration of the Kensawa Dam removal in the 1960s. There were alternatives to the destruction of our community here. We came up with those alternatives, to be clear. Seneca people did not let subsuming of home sites to dammed waters happen without a fight, but did its best to oppose through the legal mechanism of the 1794 Canandaigua Treaty. Treaties, even the so-called lost ones in California, are a living presence to us that continue to shape the US, Canada, Mexico nation states, states across the US that were formed post-treaty making eras like California, our universities like UCLA, and here I'd ask for the PowerPoint to come up. The towns and cities you all come from in all lands across North America are formed by these living presences of treaties. Treaties, our treaties, particularly in Haudenosaunee communities, are enacted yearly. Still, they are a presence made invisible, though, through the manipulative hand of settler colonialism and education. As I think about presence, I also encounter enclosure. I thought about removal and all the ways Indians have become enclosed in property logics. As I cross Corn Planters Bridge, I feel the power of dispossession. But that presence of knowing that deep history puts that in my back mirror. As I walk into the Seneca Nation's modern building with a powerful Seneca aesthetics and a purpose I feel inside that building, I feel the power of survivance And that power is deeply tied to us being present on the land, outside of a logic of enclosure. Reservations as a site of enclosure have become synonymous with Indian home sites. From the start, the reservation was patrolled by the military and the Indian agent, who is the warden, making Indian mobility dangerous as whole states such as Oregon and Colorado, yes, those in uprising now, embraced the planning tools of white supremacy to affirm rights to property taken by force. These landscapes were not naturally settled, nor coincidentally done so by white settlers. Rather, the best lands which had been tilled by generations of Native women and men were delved out. Post-Civil War, when Blacks were freed and Indian lands opened up to help the markets of a devastated US country grow, nation state grow, the lands were given to poor whites. There are legal boundaries with laws that apply differently to Native people. Many of these colonial laws have led to this increased violence against Native peoples, such as, if you read the work of Sarah Deer, and economic poverty, which our very own Randall Akey, who is actually now the chair of American Indian Studies, thank goodness, also studies at UCLA. So while we must engage with legal ramifications of our enclosure daily, our embodied sovereignty defies the logics as we move across and with the land, with presence. So just as in the case of the Kinzua Dam, the civil planning of the dam and the New Deals that continued the bolstering of white town economies over honoring treaty rights, we continue with that presence, with that purpose, with that intention. So the presence of this is there, and it continues as we witnessed it in Standing Rock in Canada, the Micmac struggles that are ongoing right now in Nova Scotia, or as the Northwest tribes fight their lifeways and against mining that will harm the salmon and the salmon's life, a life of the salmon and the non-human that is intricately tied to our sovereignty. Here, all of this, I recall my uncle's words who reminded me that it was not us protecting the land's sovereignty, but the land protecting our sovereignty, that embodies sovereignty as living humans living with the non-human. So when we think about territory, it is too often done in relation to these property logics. These logics themselves are undergirded by other forms of destructive logics, such as patriarchy and racial logics. For many Indigenous people, sovereignty and land is not just linked to the law. When we think about territory, it is something seemingly stable acted upon, not acted in concert with the non-human. It is not a shared relation, but it becomes merely the legal traces of what it means to be human. It doesn't see what territory in this way, doesn't see the waterways, animals, and all of nature having its own way of making place in the world. So when territory and Indians become involved, there also becomes an enclosure of temporality here as well. That is, we are seemingly enclosed in the past. The Seneca people even went so far as to create an alternative planned redirecting waters that would not displace our families during the building of the Kinzua Dam. So despite this displacement and violent enforcement of eminent domain by US law having taken place in our living relatives' lifetime, that is in the 1960s, the general public views Indians owning or having land or being on the land, even just on the land, as antiquated in nostalgic past. Kennedy broke this oldest of treaties, not in a distant past, but in 1961. So the enclosures of settler modernity cannot reconcile with demands for hashtag land back, look it up, it's really interesting, as these claims are viewed as stemming from a moment of contact in 1492. The ongoing dispossession are just a few examples of how settler temporalities enclose land into private property and into seeking limitations of the ownership itself. The worst nature of enclosure, however, is in how we think and engage with each other, with land and with the non-human. This enclosure forms a hierarchy that dismisses previous ways of understanding our roles or prohibits future ways of engaging and relating to each other. Mohawk artist and scholar Deborah Dockstader reminds us that the biggest lie they could have us believe is that our political, moral, and societal organizing is part of the primitive and no longer matter in this modern world. Dockstader profoundly asks, however, will Euro-based societies form the frame of our thought and creativity, or will we be able to see through the surface domination to something more? Again, I think of this as I travel through my home and come across the point I accidentally hit left in the road. My daughter is renewing beating in our family and asks us to stop. As we gather the lifeless form and spend the morning harvesting the quills for earrings, such as the ones I have on, I think about this creature's presence and the presence of our ancestors. The quill tradition in the Northeast connects us to the land, to the non-human. It's thought, and it can be a point of storytelling. My mom begins to pull out ermine tales and vintage beads for her granddaughter and unravel stories told to her by my great-grandmother as her personal confidant. Stories not present are always on that surface, waiting. And as we connect with the life of the porcupine killed through technology and mass development, it's actually becoming harder to get porcupine quills. We connect with each other and honor these connections in ways that other state is not relevant in today's society. These reciprocal relationships is something more Dockstader refers to that has helped Native people survive the destruction of our ancestors and provide pivotal information on how to do so for the future. The nature of all relationships that look at connection, that look for a meaningful presence of being, are necessary for all as we see the repercussions of not paying attention to them and our human connections, and especially not paying attention to the presence of the non-human connections. In California, I've come to learn of the presence of the Tomva and learn the destruction of the land now covered by 95% development. In names such as Topanga and others with the GNA that you see in our streets, we hear the language, but do not acknowledge the living people who continue in their relationships to the land. I have had the honor at UCLA to work with the Tomva, Tataviam, and Chumash and others from Southern California. They know not only the present lands we reside on, but the deep histories, and thus can imagine a future where restoration of waterways and land thrive and work as gathering places. They know the science. When the community and I worked on the acknowledgements that you see recited at UCLA and in the opening of this event, we introduced ourselves in relation to the Tomva. This acknowledgement was important. It was a place-based acknowledgement done in consultation. The community did not just want to see themselves as a point of loss, that past, that temporal enclosure I was talking about, but as part of the present and future. Most of all, they wanted to form a relationship to all students on campus, a meaningful presence that might have you all think of what it means to reside on Tomva land and your relationship to the humans and non-humans. Recently, there has been advocacy from students at UCLA to rename the Jan Steps, and at other universities, such as Nick's slide with the land grab piece, to acknowledge and expose the exploitive foundations of many of our universities. I get the desire to create spaces on campus that acknowledge the presence of all ancestors, yet missteps were taken. The Gabrielino Tomva community were not consulted, and when there was pushback, racist rhetoric of calling these people cultural vultures bounced back to the community, not to those advocating. I speak to this in thinking through presence because sometimes we look too easily to amend a past. Creating a presence after outright practices to eliminate it, people, land, and create land into property, bury water underneath concrete, and deny one's very own existence will take more than just a renaming. In creating presence, we must ask communities how would they like to be acknowledged and invited to the table in order not to be tokenized item or an apology without meaning. The real question is, how do we renew a relationship to each other in these places we gather in? What presence does that make? So maintaining relationships to land is so difficult in the rapid developments of everyday LA. We're seeing this. Difficult for the Tomba, but also for those who miss out on the relationships between the environment and us as humans. I think as I'm traveling my home territories, what it must mean to hear the juncus or the tule grass, smell the sage of which they continue to make their small, smell the sage, and that only grows in Southern California, by the way, or to see the small fishing boats and feel that wind being out into the coves and the ocean. These are special, and as special advisor to the Chancellor, I am all the more committed to help and provide gathering areas on campus where the original peoples of this land can harvest and affirm their relationship to each other, to their youth, to the emerging generations, and to all the non-human. In fact, it is a place where we can learn at UCLA and beyond how to be in relation to a world rather than look at land as property or the transactive nature of extraction of resources. A meaning for presence means we take on accountability. We can learn and know that most of us receive our water from Owens Valley Paiute area, or that under UCLA, there is a creek redirected for the sake of campus expansion. This is not unusual. Hopefully this means we can think about our water usage as we go forth. That's a small example. Most of all, this means a meaningful acknowledgement, a meaningful presence, means we can try to create room in our curriculums, in our outreach, in our research, in our organizing politics. Most of all, I hope that we come together with a good mind, as my people say, and once we do come together, we will have Skano in peace and wellness. Thank you. Last slide, please. That will help. Hello?
Hi, this is Vic. Mishuana, thank you so much for this. There's so much here to spend time with. Particularly, I think that we might first consider presence as an idea about oneself, about not being solitary, but you're really talking to us about meaningful relationships. And I feel like this connects so deeply also to sustainability and the future of our world, human and non-human, being reliant on building a meaningful relationship with the living world around us. And it also, looking at that Tongva map, really talks about the ways in which under the crust of awareness is this bedrock of history and time that is so present and eclipsed by our Google Maps. So I'm looking forward to having more conversations about this as we go forward. Thank you again.
Thank you.
It's now my great pleasure to introduce our third and final panelist and my dear friend, Ann Carlson. Ann Carlson is an award-winning interdisciplinary artist and whose work borrows from the disciplines of dance and performance, as well as visual, conceptual, and social arts practices. Ann has been a visiting artist at numerous universities, among them Wesleyan, Stanford, and Princeton, and is now here teaching in our Department of World Arts and Cultures dance. Welcome, Ann.
I ask you to share with me today the majesty of this moment. Each moment in history is a fleeting time, precious and unique. But some stand out as moments of beginning, in which courses are set that shape decades or centuries. This can be such a moment.
What time is it now? time is it? Shh. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy kingdom come. Will. Chief Justice Earl Warren joined the Supreme Court in the segregation of our public schools is indeed a violation of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. This ruling will most assuredly I want a cookie. I was thinking, it's a little after 7:30. A little after 7:30 now. Yeah. I don't read me that again. We got. Oh please, oh please, oh please, please. Blow those bubbles again for me, will you? Oh right. I'm just I'm gonna marry a witch. I just right in the hallway or something. Anyway, I was so embarrassed. I just said, no. Glissa, je t'ai coupé assemblée. Glissa, je t'ai coupé assemblée. No. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night alive. Oh my God, there he is. I didn't know it was so short. Oh, I had to run all the way. You liar, Tommy. You liar. He said President Kennedy some 38 minutes ago. Oh, I had to run all the way. Did the bell ring yet? You liar, Tommy. You liar. The United States Supreme Court upheld the death penalty today. Stop it. Stop. Just stop. Yeah. Milk and sugar. There's always a milk and sugar in a regular. If you don't know what you want, next. She didn't even know what you want. Umbrella. $5,000 for just a studio. They won't even allow a dog. Wait, what? I don't know. How will we get down the street? Oh, Dan, Joe, Nora. Fantastic. Yeah. Oh, time might be up. It's just I know, I can't believe it. We don't have to wear masks anymore. Oh, fantastic. It's just so, oh, hold on one second. I got it. Wait. I just have to fix something. I'm sorry, you guys. Wait, hold on one second. It's just part of it. It's all part of it. It's all right. Stay with me. It's all right. It's all part of it. It's all part of it. No, it's all part of it. 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 It's okay. I'll be right back. No, it's okay. I have somebody here. It's all part of it. It's all part of it. It's all part of it. Yeah. Oh, I love you too. It's all part of it. Oh, yeah. It's all part of it. I love you. It's all part of it. 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 I love you. It's all part of it. I'll be there. Hold on one second. It's all part of it. It's all. It's all. It's all. It's. 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 Hold on. Hold on. It's. I love you. It's. It's all part of it. It's all part of it. It's all part of it. It's all part. It's. Oh. Oh. It's all part of it. Fantastic. It's all part of it. It's all part of it. It's all part of it. It's. Yeah, I love you. Oh, Anne, thank you. Oh my goodness. Thank you for this reminder of how precious
this life is. Yes, it's all part of it. That empty chair, I mean, to go from birth to death in such a short moment of time, to see that expanse, you know, in another scale. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to bring back all three of our guests this evening. I want to thank each of you for the ways in which you have passionately thickened our different thoughts on presence. And before we invite our audience, students, and public attendees to engage in their own conversations, I'd like to ask you to take a moment to reflect on what you've just heard and seen. I welcome for the three of you to just offer some brief responses in the form of thoughts or musings or observations before we move into groups.
I want to say to my fellow panelists, thank you for unearthing literally what you have. I'm really moved and changed by your words and your lived experience. That's I can say that now, and then if you talk, then I'll probably say something else.
Well, thank you, Anne, for going first. That's very helpful. But it's only fair because you didn't. I have to say your piece is super moving, especially thinking about the way your body operated throughout time, through your narrative or the disjuncture of your narrative, but seeing your body move in time in relation to that. And I couldn't help but think about the overlap between how I think of Kennedy and the way that you're presenting Kennedy there. And so that might be something for a larger discussion, but I really, truly appreciated it. And also, you know, I appreciated Tiffany's work as well. And thinking about stereotype threat and how that operates. I feel like we go through that at every step of our education, especially as Native children. And it kind of ties into to what I'm saying, that we have our own technological science and knowledge that actually the environmental world with the Anthropocene is just catching up to, in terms of how we have thought about the relationship between water, land, people, animals, etc. Like that is part of our traditional stories and has been in those. So I think about what all that means and what you can bring when you bring these personal presences and experiences together. So thank you both.
Yeah.
I also think both of you, it just reminds me of how powerful like interdisciplinary perspectives are. Like I just got such different insights from such different perspectives, and like I feel touched in different ways, right? Because I think like in the present moment right now, I think we all are thinking about how precious life is and mortality, and we are all thinking about conservation and how we think about land, and we're being made so meaningfully aware of how we are in relation to the land, right? That we can't have a relationship, it's not sustainable where we're just dominating the land, right? That there is an interconnectivity to it. And this has been wonderful just to see these different perspectives.
And I would say too that all three of you have reminded us in each your different ways about the dangers of detachment, about the absolute necessity to be fully engaged in this life and in our awareness of the meaningful relationships we can create and the responsibility we have to attend to the ways in which our presence is part of the foundation of, is the foundation of relationships. And so we have to not isolate at all. I'm going to make a shift now. We'll come back to you in a moment, but what I would like to do is to make use of our Zoom technology to bring us closer together. It's really Zoom for non-detachment. So here comes the further engagement portion of our program. For the next 12 to 15 minutes, we invite you to consider what you have heard about presence this evening. Is there a standout moment, a new insight, something you want to know more about, an interesting friction that will lead to a question you would like to ask our panelists? Students, you received an email today with the Zoom address you will go to next. The link is also posted in the chat, I hope. So as long as that, oh, I see it. As long as that link is there, please head there immediately. Tree, we will meet you. And for those non-enrolled guests, friends, faculty, colleagues who wish to engage one another in a small group, please look in the chat function to find a link that will take you to a separate Zoom meeting where you will join breakout rooms for discussion. Note that you will leave this webinar space to participate in these discussions, and then you'll return to the webinar afterwards. Instructions will be available every step of the way. And for those of you who prefer to stay put right where you are, virtually speaking, in just a moment, we'll be sharing with you on screen works from the artist Rosie Lee Tompkins. As part of their coursework each week, students are considering and discussing selected artworks and/or readings that relate to the week's particular question. New York Times art critic Roberta Smith called Rosie Lee Tompkins an exemplar of one of the country's premier visual traditions, African American improvisational quilt making. We believe her work has a lot to do with presence and invite you to contemplate the same questions we are posing to our students as you view examples of Tompkins' work over the next several moments. So with no further delay, regardless of whether you journey to a breakout room or pause to look at Rosie Lee Tompkins' work, enjoy, and we'll see you back here in this space in about 12 to 15 minutes. See you. I hope you've had some time to consider tonight's presentations. I'm going to just start that again. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back twice. I hope you've had some time to consider tonight's presentations. I know for myself that 12 minutes in a breakout room is really short. There's always lots to say. But in just a few moments, we're going to look forward to posing some of your questions to our panelists. However, first, I wonder, Anne, Tiffany, Mishuana, do you have any further thoughts you'd like to share before we take questions?
I guess I would like to say that I hope everybody, that the students especially, move forward along a path where they let their presence be known, where they know that everybody has gifts. They're not operating from a place of deficiency. I think about Tiffany's work here. I think about my work here, where we have a saying, and I've used it with my kids a lot, much to their chagrin, but don't throw off the gifts the Creator gave you. You know, you need to use that. That's your responsibility and your accountability. And we all have different gifts to give. And so I hope all the students think about that as a sort of presence, like using the gifts that you have. You don't all have the same gifts for a reason, because it takes a lot to takes a lot to make a world come into balance. So I hope you all work across those different lines with each other and learn from each other's gifts. I know it's hard on the virtual world, but I do hope you students get a chance to know that and understand that.
So
Beautiful.
appreciate that. Yeah.
I was thinking too, in kind of contrast to the structure of the work that I did just then. I have a dear friend that keeps saying, life is long. Like if I come to her with troubles or something, she'll just say, it's all right, life is long. And I'm reminded of that now in the context of discovering our gifts. That it's a lifetime process of discovering those gifts. Sometimes they're not so present, and by being present, they come, or we discover those things, or maybe we come back to them, something that we knew as children. So that's also such a process of taking up our gifts.
And I think then it's really important to not be afraid of making mistakes, where I feel like we live in a world where we're terrified to make a mistake. And how could you know what you're drawn to or find the thing to say unless you tried to say it, unless you tried to find out? And so I think just being willing to be fully alive and take those risks is a big part of discovering your gifts, and also feeling that you have embodied your life.
I think of one of my favorite authors, and this came up recently in a discussion with a friend where her relative had passed, and we stepped up to try to help her teach. And she reminded me of the saying from Ella Deloria's novel, Water Lily, in what she's asked, like, aren't you afraid? And Water Lily says, I am not afraid, I have relatives. And that's like part of reaching out to each other and being present, I think, and reaching out to each other, is that's what helps you not be afraid, is having that interconnections.
And I think then, as you say that, I think, and then you want to feel that those interconnections are built on love. So how do we cultivate that love? And I always feel like, stop worrying about getting love, work on work on giving love. Yeah. Well, we have a lot of questions that are adding up here, and I wonder if I could just go to some of these and share them with you all. I don't think that there's any designated for one person, so please feel free to answer them. And let's be short with our answers, because there's a whole lot of questions. Are there different ways to be present?
So I love that question a lot, and I think it's important to think about and to acknowledge that there are different ways to be present, right, and to contribute to causes, because often like time is a commodity, and often like we can't be at multiple places at one time, and that's, I think, really important for students who have really demanding studies, and sometimes there's a pull like to want to be present, especially contributing to a social issue. And I think there are ways to, again, in thinking about how do you integrate like your daily activities into the causes that you care about, I think that you could be present in more traditional ways, but you also could think about your studies, your path to your career fields, your scholarship as being tied to those social issues, and actually helping people who might be serving those causes in more traditional ways. And so I think there's presence in that way. There's also presence in trying to indirectly support and help people who are doing the work that you can't do because of maybe demands tied to being a student. So I think there's a necessity to have a flexible way of thinking about being present, like for the things that we care about. And yeah, I think it's so important to have some flexibility on presence, and to not just think that there's only one way to contribute, or one way, if we're thinking about being present with our social others that we care about, like to have an impact and to nurture those bonds.
Thank you for that, Tiffany. I'm going to just go to another question because there are so many. Was there any big wake-up call moment that helped you realize your presence? And if so, has that experience helped you stay in the moment? And can you give advice for getting in the moment?
I think I'd combine this with a question, another question about being afraid in PC culture of doing things right, right? I think for American Indians, people are often just afraid. Like they're just afraid to even reach out to a tribe and talk to them, or they're afraid they're going to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. And people do. Inevitably, you make mistakes, you know? And I think it's being present and knowing that your intention and your purpose is there. And so when I think of how presence should operate, or making presence, or making relationalities between you and somebody else with intention and purpose, you're going to make mistakes. We're human beings. And that's why in like Native traditions, and I'm actually trained as a literary scholar, but I do a lot with social science at UCLA, I think just because of the nature of how campus is organized sometimes. But I bring with me every day the stories that all those stories are there for a reason, because humans commit errors, right? And they're there to teach us what to do in those moments of error making. So I think when I go into working, I remember what's my intent and my purpose and my meaning, but I'm also there to listen and understand, because inevitably you can make mistakes. I do this at every chance that I get. I work with the most wonderful Black feminist scholars at UCLA. If I make a mistake, they let me know, because I have that relationship of trust there with people to know when you make mistakes and when you don't. And you will inevitably. I have done it with the Tomba. I've made mistakes, and I have good relationships with the elders who will be like, take me aside and say, you have to do this, right? So I think the first thing to know is that you also have to be accountable to those mistakes, and that requires being present in the moment in a particular way. And I think that's probably been the best wake up call I've had about being present, is that I know I'm going to make a mistake. Cause just like everybody who probably ends up being a UCLA professor, I had a little bit of a type A personality. I, never wanted to make a mistake. I remember going home my first quarter in grad school, in undergrad, where I went to Dartmouth, and I was crying because I got a B+ in Russian. I was really bad at Russian. And I was crying because I got a B+, and I just, it took me a while to understand that it is okay. It's okay not to, always have to be that kind of presence, where you can be presence in that you're giving it your best, you're trying, you're going to make a mistake, and there's always going to be those opportunities. And here I think at Anne's work, opportunities in life to find different directions. It might lead you down different roads. I wouldn't be down the road now that I'm in if I was maybe good at Russian. I was really bad at Russian.
Yeah. and it's good you found out. It's good you found out that you're not good at Russian, because then you were able to discover your other abilities.
Oh yeah, I had
right? Everybody has something special. Maybe Russian wasn't it, but yeah. Well, I'm reminded of the beautiful story. B+, anyway, is okay, not terrible. But anyway, where my perfectionism meets my heart, like meets my heart of just being, I can be present to my resistance to making mistakes. I also reminds me of working on a project years ago for an idea of a television show for girls, and to empower girls. This is a long time ago, early 90s. And we made up this song. When you make a mistake and you've made a mistake, just say, I made a mistake. So we were like singing that all the time and trying to, I know it sounds really corny, but there is something about as you were saying, the kind of river of realization
The mistakes are part of it. You know, the light that turned off in the middle of the thing, it's all part of it, that mistake. And I often think, and I don't know about you guys in your writing and your thinking, and Vic also, I know you know this as a choreographer, that mistakes are golden. They're the moment that is like, ah, yes. So that that the beauty and golden moment in the mistake. So I'm always hunting for it because it's just such a breath of fresh air. One last thing to the questioner. A while back, I wasn't doing it recently, but I was trying a practice where I was just doing one thing at a time. Do one thing, try doing one thing at a time. That would be my advice for a kind of presence in this day. Do one thing at a time. It's like almost impossible. But anyway, yeah, do one thing at a time. Or try, a suggestion, not advice.
I have another question for you all. That was some beautiful answers to a beautiful question. Let's see if I can get this one out. Mishuana and Anne both implied the necessity of being fully engaged in this life through exerting meaning to our external environment, as well as internally accepting every part of our precious life. How shall we align these external and internal factors and form an integrated idea of what presence means to us?
It's a stumper.
I'm just having a thought. I don't have an answer, but let me just provoke the question a little bit further. The idea that there is an inside and an outside, where does that come from? And should we be reverent about that? Or could we actually maybe mess with this idea of inside, outside? Or not?
Well, it's a very Cartesian idea, but I don't know how much we want to get into that. I mean, I guess that's what I was talking about with land always being connected. It's not like we don't live on the land. So whatever land we live on, it is connected. So while I've been here, I have lots of water, and it makes me think differently about how I shower, or how I, it's actually kind of luxurious. I like it because I'm very careful when I'm in Los Angeles about taking long showers or baths or whatever. But here it's like there's so much water. So very excited. So I don't know if that's like my pleasure or my desire to have a long bath in LA. I don't do that because I guess I don't see that as I feel like I'm part of this world. So I guess I don't have that kind of binary, that Cartesian binary that also relates to mind body, because I know that my mind is affected by my external environment as well, which is my body being affected, right? So I don't know if that makes sense, but I also think about it in terms of mapping. So I have different, and part of my other work, I do a lot with mapping, and a lot of Cartesian's mappings are about detaching from place, whereas old forms of native maps would actually be written in regards to time, how long it would take you to get someplace. So it would be more like topographical maps in a way. So, the links between places were about how many mountains you had to climb, or how it went through rivers, or the rough terrain versus easy terrain. So I think about the different ways we consider geographies in relation to how we travel through them in embodiment ways. And I don't want to get too theoretical, but that might have there. So I'll leave how I think about that.
Myself because there was a siren, so here I am back again. How about Tiffany? I wonder, there's a really interesting question here for you. this person is asking about the weight or claustrophobia we feel, or that is felt in the modern world. I think that's the one we're in now. Specifically, systemic anti-presencing tactics and institutions. So maybe would you just, I think perhaps what we're partly asking for is to just help us understand the way institutions, maybe even a university, might make us feel less present.
Yeah, so there's lots of what directions to go with that question, right? Because institutions matter a lot, especially in connection to some of the conversations that was just happening about like the connections, how things are just inherently connected. And so individuals, like we have a particular experience within institutions, and institutions are like I identify as a cultural psychologist, and so institutions are never culture neutral, right? So they're always set up with a particular set of ideas and practices and values, right? And so that means that there tends to be privilege when individuals who are interacting in those spaces have an alignment with those values and ideas and practices. And so one way to think about this is that institutions can be very powerful, right? And that they can be more flexible, and they can think about, well, how might daily practices that happen in institutions or that happen in classrooms, for example, how might they welcome in multiple sets of values, multiple cultural ideas and practices, including practices like tied to social justice, or practices tied to paying more attention to context and what is the value and the reward structure tied to that. And so often our institutions, if we're having an experience of feeling, I think, claustrophobic, or like there is a misalignment or in work that has been done in social and cultural psychology, it's called a mismatch. Sometimes there's an institutional mismatch that actually can happen. And but there, I think, are kind of really like meaningful ways to restructure. And they're actually sometimes surprisingly small ways that can signal that, hey, these different ways of being and ideas and practices are valued, and they don't come at a zero-sum cost, right? So it's not that like, oh, if we shift the institution or the daily practices in the institutions to value multiple sets of values, that some of the values that some people have, like that those also can't be honored, right? So it's almost like there's like expanding is not inherently zero sum. Yeah.
Thank you. Do others of you want to add on to that or respond to that question? If not, I've got another one for you. All right,
Go
here we
for
go.
it.
And Carlson, here are 3 questions you choose. The first one is, what was your thought process for the performance? The second one is, how did you come up with the concept of rebirth and death? And the third one is, did the idea of scaring us a little bit in the end when you left the frame go to the idea of death and being afraid in the last moments?
The last question is yes. And the second question, the first question, I want to say that this is an excerpt from an early work called Blanket. And the score, the sound score that wasn't live, was composed by a man named Andy Kirshner, a brilliant composer, and he is now at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And I'll say quickly that it emerged out of some documentary makers that I learned about that were doing a piece on the young people that were at Kent State. And somehow it came around to the fact that what happened when you were around 7 or 8, and how that might impact your worldview for maybe a long time, maybe the rest of your life. So that was the Kennedy reference. And you had mentioned so it was set up in my own timeline with things that had happened. But for this, because it was 10 minutes, what I did was remember the piece live. So it didn't come out necessarily in chronological order, but I remembered and then pushed to the present. So as if stepping into the present, that there is a kind of death in the present moment, that there's a sort of release in the present, a kind of surrender, and not a literal death maybe, but I was referencing death, but referencing the present at the same time. And also I had listened to this speech talk by Albert Einstein, where he said, well, I'll just give a layperson's definition of the theory of relativity. It's that all of time exists in the present. And I just grabbed that and thought, oh, then I can access my infancy. I can access the time I was in my mother's uterus and she's laying on the couch listening to the McCarthy trials. Oh, I can access, certainly I can remember getting language later. And anyway, so that was the idea. But for us too, I was just thinking a lot about also time, clock time I was referencing, but that clock time is just one way, one thing, one way to measure it. I hope that answers.
It's so rich. I have a question here. What do you say to people for whom being present is too painful in all circumstances and at all time? And I think that while this may, be a very individual thing, also this time, this moment that we're in, where all time is encapsulated in this present, it is very painful for so many people at different degrees. So yeah, so it's a really great question. Thank you.
It is. It is.
I think of it as different scales, maybe, right? Like there's different scales that we have. There's, being present in one's body, being presence in one's house, which we're all a lot presence in one's house, maybe being present with one's spouse, maybe not. Maybe being present outside of that with friends on Zoom or whatever. How have people reached out? I think there was a moment when people were reaching out a lot via Zoom until we all got overwhelmed with it. And that might cause people to close down. I don't know. I just think about the different scales, and maybe this is some of the work that I do as doing geography, but like thinking of those different scales of approaches to that presence. And I don't think any of them's wrong. I think we have to be present. We have to be present more so at the scale of our own individual selves. And I think if anything, this moment is kind of teaching this that, right? Because you can watch right now, because I know that I'm not running all around campus from meeting to meeting. I'm sitting in Zoom meetings, or I'm doing work or whatever. I can have the news on all the time, which is not being, it's just, I can't do it. I have to shut it down. So I have whole days I'm like, I can't watch the news today, because it's just that kind of presence in my life is harmful. So I think we all kind of work on those different scales of what we can engage on. Maybe it's minute by minute, or maybe it's day by day. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but I just try to being self-aware of that, maybe in terms of the presence. That's how I'm getting by, but
okay. This is a really deep, important question. What specific steps can I take as a teacher of small children, primarily of color, to foster a sense of presence? I want my kids to feel empowered to own all that they bring to the table.
Mm.
Sometimes quiet is good. It's just thinking time, right? On Zoom, we notice it more, but I think we can sit with that for a moment because it's a really important question.
So yeah, I agree. I think it's an important question. I wonder what age of students we're talking about. I know it says small children, but I think one way to try to welcome in and empower, I think individuals, especially in a classroom setting, I think absolutely is through your curriculum choices, right? Like, so making sure that in the stories that are being read, if there are video clips that are shown, right, that there's like intersectional representation, right, that there is authentic representation of perspectives, right, that speak to the multiple identities that students in the classroom might hold and that affirm those identities as welcomed and as valued and valid. I think that's one way of engaging students' interests, of making them feel like that part of themselves is not only like something that they have to fear that like, oh, is it going to be a source of threat, but also that that it's actually valued in this space, right? That it's and that it's something that can be engaged, right? That whatever knowledge students might have tied to those identities, that it's welcomed there, and that it can be a source of creativity. And so I think a practical thing to empower students, especially I think across ages, is to really think about like what materials are being brought into the classroom at every level, right? So if you're doing a PowerPoint, like what are the cultural references that are being made? How inclusive are they? And really like trying to speak to the interests and of the students.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I think we have time maybe for one more question, as long as our answer is relatively brief, because then I want to leave you each a little time to conclude. So, but this question is going to go to Mishuana. It's about the Jan steps. Is the renaming of Jan steps without establishing a connection or relationship between the Tongva and the land harmful rather than helpful? And then, oh, here it goes. And we open up this question similarly. Is renaming locations as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement without highlighting the history behind the renaming harmful, since it doesn't help us remember historical oppression? Wow. Okay, so I just said these are going to be short answers. This is absurd. We can't possibly, but perhaps you could give us something to think about that will carry with us when we leave this evening.
Yeah, my understanding is that renaming of the Jan Stip was not just about American Indians, but they were trying to figure out how to recognize a history, and that history of oppression, which I think is very, very important. Not consulting the Tongva, that was a misstep. Like I said, I truly believe that was a misstep in the conversation, because asking people how they want to be recognized, how they want their presence known on campus is super important. And especially when you're talking to vulnerable populations. And the Tongva community in LA, when they see 95% of their lands developed, they have no land base, they don't have access to their gathering materials. It's incredibly painful to them, primarily. So the steps, that's not exactly meaningful. That's in the same ways, but that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a conversation about it. And I think the same could be, I look at these as place-based issues too, right? So I can't speak to all the Civil War monuments or all the BLM monuments everywhere, right? Some may be more meaningful than others. Like there's statues that maybe should stay, but maybe not all of those put up in the Jim Crow era with the Daughters of Confederacy. Right now, I feel like the news and the media, they flatten everything. And there needs to be a place-based discussion about each and every one of these issues, and there does need to be education involved. So does it do more harm than good? I think the backlash that happened, the Tomva did feel that, and that was painful to them. And I don't, we were also, nobody really talked to people that are working with them. And there's a lot going on campus that are more meaningful. Like Victoria Sork is really doing a concerted effort at the botanical gardens. There's other places all around campus. American Indian Studies Center is always working with local tribal communities. There's numerous places on campus, and Ananda Moran in education at one of our junior faculty. It's amazing, and doing land-based pedagogies. So there are ways to talk across these differences and to talk to people before you make these steps. I think sometimes it's about process. So I'm not going to say it's harmful or not harmful, but it's about process. And sometimes our presence is about process, right? How do we work out these processes? And that doesn't, and you know, I commend the students, I really do, because they really are looking at the history, the deep history of UCLA and its foundations. I put up that land grab university because if you want to know how many parcels, how much funding, all of that, most people will say, oh, well, it wasn't gifted land. Well, no, the land grant part of it came about because there are numerous land grants involved with the founding of UCLA. From up to Arthur Letts got a land grant in Canada for killing Indians and fighting Indians, all the way down to how Mexican land grants to Spanish to Mexican land grants, and then US land grants worked. It was shifting. It was a property shifting of land titles to make land into property and dispossess Tomva people. So, I mean, there's ways of understanding that we have to address, and I commend the students for that. But we also have to think about the process in which we do so. What is creating meaningful presence?
Thank you, Mishuana. Actually, what I want to do now, because we are, you know, on a clock, Anne, if you can believe it. I want to just ask Tiffany and Anne each to just, you know, it can be very, very short, but a closing thought that, you know, it's nothing is concluded, but to take with us for the evening.
I still am very struck by the question about thinking about the present as too painful to engage. And I think that there are definitely times when it does feel that way, right? Like it feels like there's so much that we're trying to attend to and to process. And I just want to acknowledge that that's okay to feel that way, and that sometimes it can be helpful to have a long time perspective and to recognize that like in the present, for a variety of reasons, like we may want to have an impact on, like, for our family, for a given social issue, and that we need to be okay, and that there's opportunities in the future to help, right, and to engage then. Like, I think it's okay to not engage at every present moment, right? Like to kind of have a awareness, right, that something is too much and that something's painful. And I also want to acknowledge, since we're talking about time, about the beauty of the past, right? That sometimes it is so helpful, and it helps us to, I think, feel both smaller and bigger, to recognize like our connections to the past, and to recognize that some of the things that we're experiencing as a society, as individuals, is not unique, that it has happened in the past, and that others have grappled with these issues, and we can kind of get wisdom and insights from them. But I really, like, I am really struck by that question. And I do think it is such a painful time, and it is a challenging time to always be like able to engage. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that.
Thank you, Tiffany.
Yeah. I love the process of even these relatively short exposures to, I'll say, each other, how my head can get turned around, like just a gentle rewiring. I can see, feel, think a bit differently. And that happened for me tonight. And thank you, Vic, and everyone that made this possible. Anyway, yeah.
Well, this, what an extraordinary way to begin 10 questions. The three of you have been amazing. I want to thank you all, our guests and our audience, for your presence tonight. And whether your loved ones are near or far away, let's depart this gathering with an intention towards creating a meaningful presence, working for fuller awareness of our relationships with others, not only those who are already in our circle of care, but also for those who are present, but less known to us. And in that, I want to acknowledge not only the presence of fellow humans, but also of the non-human life that grows and changes around us. This concludes this evening's program, 10 Questions, What is Presence? We hope you will join us again next week for What is Justice? Same time, new link. And to learn more about the entire series or to RSVP, please visit arts.ucla.edu/10questions.